Welcome to North Yorkshire and to the Church of St Andrews in the village of Aldborough, which is about 15 miles to the northwest of York. We're here to help celebrate the Northern Aldborough Festival, a feast of classical music in this enchanting church and environment which attracts artists from all over the world. The church is built on the site of an old Roman forum, and in the 19th century they unearthed the statue of the god Mercury, which is today on show in the back of the church. Mercury, of course, was the fleet-footed, mercurial god of trade, travel and thieves, which takes me one way or another to our panel. David Davis, former Shadow Home Secretary, former member of the very fleet-footed SAS. He now campaigns against the Securocrats on behalf of the ancient liberties of the citizen. On Desert Island Discs, one of his choices was a song called Stealing My Democracy. Salma Yaqoob was one of the founders and now the leader of the Respect Party, which has a member of parliament in the personage of George Galloway. The party's name is an acronym for respect, equality, socialism, peace, environmentalism, community and trade unionism. It may safely be said that Douglas Murray's concept of respect does not embrace at least all of those qualities. As the Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society, he is a strong believer in capitalism. Well, he gives it 2 cheers anyway. And the protection of liberal democracy around the world via the military strength of the Allied Western nations. His latest book is Bloody Sunday. It's a history of the Savile Inquiry. Alan Johnson held several cabinet posts in the New Labour years. Appointed Shadow Chancellor by Ed Miliband, he stood down last year from what he described as a, forgive the phrase, bloody depressing job. And he appears to be much happier as a result. True?
True. He said, gulping his water quickly.
Our panel.
So are the rest of us.
Our first question, please.
John Taylor. After such appalling atrocities, why did the United Nations, the West, Russia and China not intervene to help the Syrian people?
David Davis.
Well, sometimes you have to recognise there are things you can't do. The simple truth is to intervene in Syria would be bloodier and more unpleasant than the intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan put together. I mean, they estimate something like 100,000 people have died as a result of the Iraq war. I suspect the numbers will be worse for Syria. I mean, one of the problems, well, not one of the problems, the driving problem, I guess, in Syria today is the repressive minority led by Assad, mostly Alawite, part of the Alawite sect, and there are about 2 million of those. I suspect if Assad fell, a very large number of those people would die. So the 100,000 in Iraq may be a small number by comparison. So there are no easy answers. I'd love to be able to say to you, this is the solution, this is the way to do it, this is what we should do. This is one of those ones where I'm afraid civilized people have to just hold their breath and hope.
Douglas Murray.
Well, the last person to think that whatever would happen or whatever should happen in Syria could or would ever be simple. It's a very complex situation. I think that goes without saying. What's simple about it, what is straightforward, comes back to the question on why the UN, particularly Russia and China you mentioned, will not do anything. I'm afraid that's very straightforward. The UN Security Council cannot work, does not work in a case like this. Every actor involved knows that it does not and cannot work. The UN Security Council will not come up with a resolution because Russia and China have no reason to have a resolution suggesting UN action in Syria because of their business interests there, because of their serious holdings within that area, and for many other issues of realpolitik for them. So when people say we must rely on the UN, they must be aware that the UN cannot solve this problem. The question then comes back to whether or not a country like this one can do anything. And I have to say that of the options before us, as I said, there are no simple ones. There are things we could think of doing, such as helping an international force to have a no-fly zone, stopping the use of helicopter gunships over areas that Assad's forces have been in. But none of it is straightforward. And I just add one other thing. I do wish, when discussing this, that our politicians, I'm not thinking of the ones on this panel, but that our politicians in this country were a bit more frank with the people about this. Because in recent days, both William Hague and David Cameron have decried, and rightly decried, the atrocities in Syria. But it's no good just continuing to decry them. You have to say what you would do. And the fact is, if we cannot as a country any longer be the sort of country that can express and defend our values, including innocent civilian life, including defending innocent civilian life, if we cannot cannot do that anymore, then I wish we'd just say so and not go through the pretense that we care about this and we'd like to do something, but perhaps the UN can do something, because that is simply a road to nothing.
Salma Yaqoob.
Well, I shall answer Douglas Murray by saying, actually, the truth is our country is not in a position to militarily intervene. And even if it were, the military intervention would not actually help the situation. Of course, what is happening is terrible. There are massacres happening. People are dying. That is not in dispute. But whenever you talk about an intervention, surely the point of an intervention is to make something better, not worse. And if we were to either back or go in ourselves, which isn't an option, let's face it, we've already had overstretch from Iraq, we're struggling to get out of Afghanistan, it's not an option, and especially with the military cuts, 20%, we're going to see a reduction in the army. We know that militarily we're not going to actually do something, but we can still diplomatically. And I would support what was now being referred to as Annan Plus, as we need to see a renewed diplomatic effort. And yes, Russia and China should continue to be pressured to assert a stronger influence on Assad. We've seen an example with Yemen, where the people rose up, they were brutally put down, but through getting people round the table, all the players, people from the regime, as well as the opposition, as well as people within the region, actually an ordered transition took place. And that's what needs to take place in Syria. Assad has to go. He does not have the credibility both inside his country in terms of the opposition that has arisen. But yes, there are sections of the Syrian population which do support him, and they cannot be ignored. We've talked about the difficulties. There's so many sects, 18 sects, and actually it's the Christians in Syria and the Alawites who are in the minority who feel most threatened should Assad fall. So there has to be some way where people feel protected in an orderly transition. And militarily intervening, it will actually make, I can tell you for a fact, as sure as we're all sitting in this church hall, the deaths won't reduce, they will actually increase. And that's why the military intervention should not be the favoured option, but diplomatic intervention must be reinforced.
Alan Johnson.
Well, the problem is, of course, those two countries that were mentioned, Russia and to a certain extent China. We can't get a UN resolution, but the UN have agreed to the Kofi Annan plan that Salma referred to. Indeed, the Arab League are the joint sponsors of Kofi Annan with the UN as an envoy to that country. And Kofi Annan's plan includes an immediate ceasefire, includes the withdrawal of troops, the release of political prisoners, the reopening of a political dialogue, and it's the only show in town. It's UN approved, it's approved by Russia, it's approved by China. And I sometimes despair when I see some of the coverage that, when the terrible events that have happened, 108 people killed last week, 98 people killed this week, and almost ridiculing Kofi Annan for making the attempt. It is still, I agree with William Hague on this, it is still the Annan six-point plan. It is the only show in town, and I think what has to happen now, as Kofi Annan said to United Nations yesterday, is the UN, including Russia and China, have to put some teeth into the Annan plan, whether that's around sanctions or whether it's about other issues, so that it can be given a reasonable chance to succeed. And I don't think it has had that reasonable chance.
You haven't mentioned the fact that Kofi Annan wants Iran to be involved as part of the contact group, and the Western nations are saying not at all.
No, yeah, but hold on.
Where are you on that? Are you with the government on that?
Kofi Annan's six-point plan is very clear.
But
aside from that, he wants to create a contact group, which was very important, incidentally, in resolving other international crises.
Should the West swallow its dislike of Iran and say, if Kofi Annan is as wise as everyone says he is, Iran should be part of this?
I personally think it's very difficult to leave Iran out of this. They are a major player, and it's very difficult to ignore them. And if we want to have a contact group that leads to the implementation of the Annan plan, I don't think you can ignore Iran as part of that.
David Davis?
I agree. The simple truth is that you have to have every neighbouring nation involved. Whether you like it or not, where are the refugees going to flee to? How are you going to provide no-fly zones if you are going to do that? How are you going to provide sanctuary for the people who will otherwise be killed in genocides? The way to do it is involve every local nation, and that includes Iran.
But Iran is currently not only arming and sending troops to help the Assad regime, but is now boasting that it is doing so under the eyes of the UN, under the eyes of the international community. To involve Iran as if Iran can help this process is like asking an arsonist to come into a burning building.
But Douglas, isn't Saudi Arabia similarly arming the opposition? And should they therefore be excluded? Don't you start then excluding all the neighbouring countries?
You could do. I simply think that in the region, the destabilising force is and has been for more than 3 decades now Iran. And that Iran, which props up the Assad regime and has done for so many years as this proxy state, which itself is also a terror sponsor, if you roll this problem back in Syria, you can roll it back straight to Tehran. And I think that there is a justifiable excuse for saying we should at least look at Iran as part of the problem. That is not to say you ignore them, it's not to say nobody ever speaks to them, but to see them as necessarily part of the solution, I think, is to get some of this very wrong.
We will leave that there, thank you, and go to our next question.
David Taylor. Should the Home Secretary poke a stick into the lion's den and appoint a former rail regulator with a non-police background to the post of HM Inspector of Constabulary?
This is Tom Windsor, whom the government has said was head and shoulders above the other candidates. And that phrase, poke a stick in the lion's den, is, I think, David Blunkett's phrase. Alan Johnson.
I think it's provocative. I think it's inept. I don't agree with the Windsor review, by the way. I am fundamentally against his incredible view that we should create an officer class in the police. He makes the point, actually, which I find rather offensive, coming from the working classes, that he recognises that the police have a core working class principle, but now they need people of high calibre, as if people of working class can't provide that high calibre. And the idea that you need an officer class when we're looking at breaking down social immobility in things like the judiciary and the army, I find incredible. But even if I thought everything that Tom Windsor said was correct, even if I thought his review was sensible and sound, which I don't, given the amount of antipathy it's caused amongst the police, to appoint him as the head of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, I just cannot understand the sense of it. The police feel at the moment alienated from this government, and I predict that come the next election, one of the biggest political problems this government will face will be crime and disorder and this alienation of our police. When I was Home Secretary, I relied on HMIC to give me expert advice on policing. For instance, there's an issue about whether I should have asked HMIC to investigate the Metropolitan Police on the hacking inquiry on Murdoch in July 2009. If I had asked HMIC to do that, Dennis O'Connor, the current head, is a former police officer, as every head of HMIC has been since it was created in 1856, he would be able to talk to the Metropolitan Police as an experienced police officer. Windsor won't be able to do that. And anything Windsor does as the head of the HMIC, because he's going to be appointed, the government are going to get their man, anything he does now will be looked at with great suspicion by Britain's police force, who already feel alienated by this government.
From a former Home Secretary to a former shadow Home Secretary, David Davis.
Well, this is one of those few occasions tonight where we're going to disagree. Firstly, let's just deal with the working class thing. I mean, actually, Alan and I share a police force which has a brilliantly good Chief Constable in Tim Hollis, at Humberside, just south of here. So it's perfectly possible to get good Chief Constables up the route, as it were. But there is a problem with the management of the police today. The police, to a very large extent, have lost a lot of public confidence for different reasons, not all in their own control. There's a great deal of difficulty in terms of getting policemen onto the streets. I mean, we hear numbers like 15% of the police hours are spent on the beat rather than doing other things. Those of you who, on hacking, Alan mentioned hacking, those of you who watched the House of Commons Select Committee interrogating the heads of counter-terrorism who were in charge of hacking may not have been impressed by what you saw, and those are our best police officers in charge of counter-terrorism. So we have a problem of actually getting reform into the police force. I don't hold the police constables responsible for this. I don't hold anybody in the police force responsible. But there's no doubt that if we're going to get lower crime and more effective policing, we need to carry through reform.
Is it a
and that's
poking
what,
a stick?
That's what Windsor is about.
Are you saying, therefore, it is indeed, as Blunkett says, poking a stick in the lion's den, but a stick that needs to be poked in the lion's den?
Well, of course, it's a wonderful metaphor. Poking a stick in a lion's den, you get it bitten off. I think he meant an ant's nest or something. But of course, it is designed to provoke change, not to provoke rebellion, reaction, antagonism, or whatever. That's the purpose of it. And the simple truth is that we really do have to get some reform of our police force if we're going to get the right outcome. And one last point, just to say how irrational some of this is. I mean, there were things in the Windsor Review which I didn't agree with, but I talked to my local police federation and they were upset about the idea that all of them would actually have to pass a fitness test. It seemed to me there are some aspects of the reaction to Tom Windsor which are just downright irrational. I want a copper to be able to chase a thief and catch him, not fall down with a heart attack halfway.
Salma Yaqoob.
I think if you're being asked to do such a serious job as reform the police, of course it would be an advantage to have gone through those ranks, to have an understanding of what it actually takes. Because it's always painful to reform, to change ways that have been set. So if you want to make that as smooth and as efficient as possible, if your intention is to have a better police force because you believe some changes need happening, then surely you need some trust from the very people that you're asking to change. And by imposing somebody, and already the fact it's controversial, that's going to be a more difficult process, not an easier process. So I think this government's got it completely wrong on this.
When you think, to use a phrase where you think if you want to have radical reform, it's better to set a copper to catch a copper than it is to have an outsider to catch the copper.
It's about making sure that that change is real and deep and not just some superficial cosmopolitan change and to grab a few headlines, but actually doesn't mean a real change from top right down to the bottom. And I think people who have been through that process, who understand how it works, have the trust of the people who they're trying to lead, because it's a leadership role ultimately, and people don't like to be forced. And by having it done in that way, I think the changes would be more meaningful and more genuine.
Douglas Murray.
Well, sometimes imposing somebody from outside, as Salma put it, is the only way to reform some of these parts of the public sector. It's the same with aspects of the NHS and many other much beloved parts of this country. We always hope that they can be reformed from within, but sometimes radical action is needed. Sometimes that is somebody being, as Salma says, imposed from without. But, one of the things that suggests to me this might not be such a bad thing are the number of vested interests that come straight out when something like this happens. There are a lot of people who would not want Tom Windsor to succeed in his task. David and indeed Alan know the lie of the land on this far better than I do, but I just wanted to make one other point, which is this. When Alan says the police feel alienated now, Alan, that is not a new thing. That isn't something that's happened only since the coalition. The police in this country can be said to have felt alienated for many years now, and it's partly because there has been a complete breakdown between the public and the police in what the public expect of the police. One week we expect them to go in and deal with rioters, and then another week there's an inquiry into it and the police are exposed one way. Another week we say, why are the police not there? Another, why are there too many?
Douglas,
there
it's the
is
first
a breakdown.
time the police have had this gap between them and the government. I can't remember the last time the police went on their version of a strike. They can't go on an official strike, so on their holiday they actually joined in the protests against the government cuts.
2 years ago. It was simply 2 years ago when Jackie Smith was Home Secretary.
OK, I'm going to leave that there with a reminder of the... Alan, you want a quick word?
Just want to answer this point. It would be different if you were dealing with a police force where public satisfaction was low and crime was rising. Actually, this government inherited the first government ever to inherit falling crime. It started with Michael Howard, Conservative Home Secretary, and it carried over that period, and enormous changes. police community support officers, neighbourhood policing, etc. But the issue is this, as I said, David, it's not about what's in that report, which says that the policing should be a graduate-only profession, for God's sake. Even if that was right, asking the man who produced a controversial report to be the head of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary with no police experience whatsoever is a hugely provocative act. They know it's a provocative act, and police officers right across this country, good police officers who put their lives on the line every day, will feel completely let down by this decision.
Which is my cue to give you the number for any answers, which is 03700 100 444, and the email address any.answers@bbc.co.uk after the Saturday broadcast of this programme, and is, incidentally, the first Any Answers with Anita Anand, fielding your calls, your emails, your tweets and texts. Plus, she's going to be, this evening, live on Twitter straight after this broadcast on the @BBC Radio 4 account / thank you. There is a lot of technology of which I'm fast acquiring huge knowledge. I'll do it once more. At the @BBC Radio 4 account, #BBCAQ. Phew, got there. Anita, I hope you're listening and get it better than I can. We'll go on to our next, please.
Philip Baldwin. Are members of the panel concerned that a company which admits logistical mistakes in providing stewards for the Jubilee weekend has secured contracts to provide security for the Olympics?
This company, I think, is a reference to Close Protection UK, which has profusely apologised because two or perhaps three of its volunteers, interns, however you want to describe them, arrived early on Saturday morning at 3 a.m. Rather than the 5 a.m. when they were expected, and there were not appropriate provisions for them. Douglas Murray.
Oh, I don't know. I've never heard of Close Protection UK till this week, and I think it was a bit bold to just decide what a company is and isn't fit for based on, frankly, as far as I can see, a couple of very alarmist newspaper headlines and a rather alarmist tweet from Mr. Prescott.
You wouldn't know he's running for office, would you?
Me?
No, Prescott.
Oh, God. I had no idea I was running for office. The problem with this story is that actually, the moment you dig a little bit beneath it, you find that the story is very much different. I was reading today accounts of other people who were working for this organisation last weekend who had a very nice day. They got some work experience and so on. So, as ever, there's a sort of proxy war going on. And once again in this country, we always fight these things in completely the wrong way. I wish we'd have a grown-up discussion in this country about the nature of work. I wish we'd have a grown-up discussion about the very, very real and serious societal issue we face with massive youth unemployment. When you have youth unemployment like we have now, it very swiftly becomes a social issue. And I just wish we would have the discussion about how we get young people into work, which will include people working for nothing for a few days or for a few weeks, getting work experience, getting things on their CV. It will involve that sometimes. But instead, once again in Britain, we have crappy class warfare from clapped-out politicians instead of a real debate.
Salma Yaqoob.
Well, I'm trying not to reel from that crappy class warfare. As somebody who comes from Birmingham and as somebody who does know the problems of inner city areas, well, in a lovely rural area this evening, but actually there are divides in society, and actually I think that's the taboo. That's not what is talked about. We should hear about big society and all of this. And you mentioned youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is increasing because of the measures of this government. Austerity is not working. Austerity was supposed to be the medicine, but actually turned out to be a poison. We're seeing people laid off work. We're seeing people who want to work but can't find jobs, and yet then themselves are blamed as some kind of scroungers. And I find real issue with that. And then to call it class warfare when people who are feeling pain
it is class
protest
warfare
about
for John
it.
Prescott tried to use the Queen's Jubilee to claim as if during the Queen's Jubilee an opportunity was being seized to simply exploit young people to work for free. That is a low discussion. We should have the discussion about not an anti this government or pro that government, but simply how we get young people into work. And it cannot be done by class warfare of the kind that you seem to find appealing.
Please don't put words in my mouth, and that does not help at all. For people who are standing up for people's dignity, don't call that class warfare. That's about standing up for people's dignity.
Everyone's for that, Salma. Everyone's for that.
This is not about saying people shouldn't have work experience. Who's going to argue against work experience? But when people are told you'll be paid X amount of money for going along and being a steward, and then find themselves having to stay the night in the outside under London Bridge without access to toilet facilities for 24 hours, I think it's right that people are allowed to have dignity.
Hold on,
Let's not
Douglas.
make it about the Jubilee. This is about a company which was getting millions of pounds for stewarding, yet when it came to paying their workers, didn't. That's the issue here. So let's not conflate the issues in this rabble-rousing way.
Alan Johnson.
Well, I want to have that big grown-up debate that Douglas talked about, because I think he's absolutely right. As I understand, Close Protection Limited are going to provide paid employment at the Olympics. But John Prescott's right. If there are incidents where people were dropped off in the middle of the night with nowhere to go, it needs to be looked into. The government can't subcontract responsibility for this. And I think John Prescott's absolutely right. The government have to check that everything was right about that. On the issue about long-term youth unemployment, if you look at the graphs anywhere in the country, you'll see that youth unemployment, 18 to 24-year-olds, was coming down at the end of the global financial problem caused by Lehman Brothers because of something called the Future Jobs Fund. It started to go up again when that policy was abandoned. And what the government have been trying to do ever since, and the work programme is the latest reiteration of this, is to find a way to encourage employers to take on young people, because they're in the worst possible situation. Most people lose their job and find another job very quickly. If you've never had a job, you fall into that trap. You can't get any work because you haven't got experience, and you can't get any experience because you can't find a job. That becomes institutionalised, it becomes generationalised, and it is the most damaging, most corrosive effect on society. The big grown-up debate takes us back to the budget. There was nothing in the budget about youth unemployment. There was nothing to encourage companies, and perhaps a national insurance holiday for taking on 18 to 24-year-olds. So employers are incentivized to do that. Perhaps putting the tax on bankers' bonuses again that provided the money to pay for the Future Jobs Fund, and will actually be able to create more money to get young people into work. That's the big grown-up debate about youth unemployment.
Alan, in which case, let's make the following agreement. We all agree that some aspects of the banking sector went very, very bad and everybody has had to pay for it, yes. But your government, the Labour government, when you came into power, had received a situation where there were balanced books, a balanced budget. And when you left, we were running a budget deficit in this country of £170 billion.
This is really strange and even perverse, because you remember Lehman Brothers collapsed. There was a global financial problem that this government didn't recognise. Nothing to do with international politics was to do with the fiscal deficit. Now, at the moment, where we're in a double-dip recession, remember this government inherited growth and delivered recession. They didn't inherit... They inherited... The fact is they inherited growth of 1.8%. They inherited growth and have delivered a recession. I know they act as if they inherited a recession and delivered growth.
Alan, I'm going to call you to order. The congregation is now... Congregation is not quite the right term under the circumstances. I'm very glad to say, is waiting to hear what David Davis has to say about this.
Well, I've been sitting here open-mouthed at the heroic defence from Alan of a government that gave us £168 billion deficit every year, not just 1 year. Now, look,
Let's come back. Hold it, everyone. Let's for the moment. Philip Baldwin asked a specific question. So just for the sake of it, let's answer the question.
I will come straight back to the question. The question was, if you remember, whether we should accept a company that makes these mistakes. You know, we're in Yorkshire. We have a saying around here, which is, he who makes no mistakes makes nout. And you know, I am the father of some children, one of whom falls in this generational group who, as Alan described, are caught in that catch-22. No experience, therefore no job. No job, therefore no experience. And frankly, if I can find a way, mistakes or not, wet morning in London or not, that gets my son onto the job ladder, getting some experience and then getting a job afterwards, I'll take it, thank you very much, and I'll take it very happily.
We'll go to our next, please.
Elizabeth Vose. In light of the criticism of the BBC's coverage of last weekend's Jubilee celebrations, has the BBC indeed lost the plot?
Given that there were a whole set of events, are you thinking specifically of the river pageant or more generally?
I'm thinking specifically of the river pageant and your tweet saying the BBC had lost the plot.
You have to be very careful. I did not say the BBC had lost the plot. How would that be? I simply said I'm told by others, and asked whether the BBC had lost the plot. You put it into a, could you rest your case for a second, David Davis, while I bring in Salma Yaqoob?
Of course, there have been complaints. You know, many people watched it. In fact, the coverage was watched by millions of people and appreciated. But there were complaints that maybe it was too dumbed down, that people wanted to know the history behind some of the boats, and this was not relayed. And people are perfectly entitled to do that. Do I think that somehow the BBC should now be attacked forever on that? No, I think it's an institution that I certainly feel proud of. It's certainly the go-to station that I would go to for authoritative information. It's respected around the world for its independence. But of course, as with any institution, where improvements can be made, they should be made.
Douglas Murray.
No, I don't think it's lost the plot, but I don't think it was by any means its finest hour. I probably shouldn't say this on this show. I'll never be invited back. I simply turned over to Sky, and but I did. I'm afraid I didn't. I mean, I think that generally, and it's not actually the BBC's fault alone. The BBC is in this terrible position. It is criticised whatever it does by somebody who says, you know, they're letting us down, they're doing worse than they've ever. There's always somebody who thinks that about the BBC. I just simply think that generally in the country at the moment, the BBC appears to have got the idea that a lot of people have got, that we've become this sort of noddyish, childlike nation who need to be spoken to as if we're teenagers. And you know, you even saw it, I have to say, in the concert the next night, which I didn't watch on any channel. Nothing on earth can persuade me to watch Gary Barlow interviewing Cheryl Cole and then watching Cliff Richard try to sing. And I'm sorry, I have nothing against any of those particular performances, but it is a very strange thing we have in Britain. We're not a grown-up society, it sometimes seems. We all have to pretend like we're kids. And apart from anything else, we're all going to work till we drop from now on, so we might as well grow up.
David Davis.
You know, I was watching actually from a rather privileged viewpoint in the House of Commons, but I had the BBC on behind me, and the first thought that struck me after watching about an hour of the BBC's rather desperate coverage was, where on earth are Dimblebys when you need them? My second thought was really rather cruel as well, which was, you know, it's a little like that phrase, military intelligence. You know, BBC management is an oxymoron with the emphasis on the last two syllables. They had a fantastic opportunity here. You know, they had 1,000 stories on that river, which they could have played and repeated. They had a fantastic 1,000 years of history they could have talked about. And what do we get? A bunch of ignorant second-class celebrities. You know, that's really what I saw. This was an occasion when our tradition, our history should have been brought together by our greatest institution, the BBC, to make us proud of what we are. I'm afraid the royal family did us proud, the BBC did not.
Alan Johnson.
Well, I didn't see this coverage, and I was going to suggest that I chair this and you join in as a panellist, Jonathan, because you obviously have very strong views on this. I didn't see the coverage. Indeed, my disappointment was that they didn't cover the splendid flotilla on Humberside and watch it from Hessle Foreshore rather than this second-rate event
That's in his
London.
constituency, by the way.
But I think Douglas makes the point. You know, when the coronation took place in 1953, very few people had television sets, and if you did, you didn't have a choice. You had to watch the BBC. Now you've got a multiple of choices. I'm a great defender of the BBC, and if you didn't like the coverage, switch over to another channel.
Thank you. Any answers? Number is 03 700 100 444, and the email address is any.answers@bbc.co.uk. To our next, please.
Judith Graham. The little word fat is under fire this week. Does the panel think that adjectives should be banned because they might upset some people?
This relates to the 1986 Act, Section 5 of which, the Public Order Act, says that using words which anyone in earshot might find insulting is a criminal offence. That is in England and in Wales, and there are those who are campaigning against this. Alan Johnson.
Oh, well, this is news to me. I wouldn't have thought. I wouldn't have thought we should spend much parliamentary time on this. Did you say the word "fat" was?
There are those.
Yes,
there are parliamentarians who are suggesting that the word "fat" is so offensive that it should conceivably be included within Section 5 because it might be a word that offends someone who hears it.
Well, I can't see that seeing the light of day. I think that sounds rather ridiculous to me. I think that if there is an issue here about obesity, and I suppose one of the issues about young people and children in particular, given that we have to tackle this scourge, which is actually the biggest health threat we face. You know, when the NHS was established, the problem was diseases like diphtheria, and if anything, malnutrition. Now, the biggest threat to our health and the biggest problem for the NHS in coping with it is obesity. So I would think if it applies anywhere, then you should be very careful about allowing children to use to receive these phrases as if it's okay to bandy them around and take the opposite view to actually encouraging youngsters onto a proper diet, because there's many adults that need to give them show them an example on that. But I wouldn't change the law to include the word fat and suggest, I don't think, David, it's an unparliamentary term. I think I could call you on the floor of the House of Commons, I could call you fat.
This is a specialist area for David Davis, so he can come to it. But there's no...
What, being fatness is my specialist area?
I thought
slimness
I was referring to Section 5 of the Public Order Act of 1986, which has engaged your political attention.
Yes, well, let's first deal with the political correctness bit. I mean, I actually think that this continuous attempt to redefine English so you can't use one bit or another is one of the corrosive aspects of our society today. I want to be able to say what I mean. I mean what I say. Now, in terms of the Public Order Act 1986, I think it was, 86 or 87.
That's what I told you.
What Jonathan's referring to is a campaign we are running because it is, would you not believe it, a criminal offence to say something which is insulting to people. Now, Alan and I would never be able to talk to each other at all. If you had to exclude insults from what we said. And I think that one of the great things about our country, one of the great things that makes us British, English, you pick what you want, is our ability to say precisely what we want, our freedom of speech. And it's one of the things that makes our country what it is, and when we do away with it, we will do away with the traditions that make us great. So I think it's a ridiculous idea, and we should just throw it out.
Salma Yaqoob.
Well, I certainly would be wary of any steps to attack our freedom of speech. Aside from the jokey aspect that people are referring to, I think it's quite dangerous when people are told what they can and can't say. But for me, I think it's a different issue. I think there is an issue of civility. So having said we're allowed to say what we want, I think there is a question, what kind of society do we want, though? And of course, I would much rather have a society where our kids, the kind of thing that we just teach our children, be nice. Don't bully other children. Don't say things which are going to hurt them deliberately. And at the moment, because there is so much emphasis, both on young women and young men now, in terms of their appearance, and being fat or being overweight is seen as socially unacceptable, and therefore to tease people on the basis of their body size it is one form of bullying. I think this is what was underlying the concern. But I don't think bringing the law in is actually going to help it. This is a cultural issue. This is an issue about how we talk to our kids and how schools talk about these issues, and how, as a society, we don't make people feel upset about their body image. At the moment, we're seeing a rise, not just in girls, but in boys, with anorexia and all sorts of psychological issues to do with weight and body image. And I think we do collectively have a responsibility in addressing these issues, these unreal expectations of how people should look, and the way that appearance and superficial issues are so, put up there, rather than actually what really matters. But bringing in the kind of strong arm of the law, telling people what they can and can't say, is certainly not the solution.
Douglas Murray.
I agree, but this comes back slightly to the point I was trying to make before. Why do people make up rules for children and enforce them? Because children don't know how to behave. Why do we treat adults differently? Because adults should know how to behave. So a child should be encouraged and indeed persuaded and sometimes forced not to be unpleasant, not to be rude, not to be unpleasant to the fat kid in class, not to tease the child who they think's gay or they think's of a different race or a different religion, not to be rude to people for being different, but to be polite to people, to learn basic manners. When they become a grown-up, it's different. And the way in which we show disapproval when people are grown-up and are horrible is by societal disapproval. It's not by making laws, it's not by throwing people into prison or keeping them for detention if they've said the wrong thing about somebody. It's by expressing things as grown-ups. Very briefly, if I may, journalists get this all the time at the moment. A few years ago, I wrote a piece attacking a decision by a council in Kent to award... somebody was awarded thousands of pounds of compensation because they were of Irish heritage and had heard a joke about an Irishman within hearing distance. And I wrote a piece at the time saying that it is absurd that somebody gets more money for facing an incoming joke in Kent than our soldiers do for an incoming bullet in Afghanistan. And I was then reported to the police, among others, and the Press Complaints Commission and others, for allegedly committing yet another offence. You become a one-man walking crime wave if you even talk about this sort of area now. And so the fact is we just have to grow up. Again, I plea to grow up and realise there's a difference between children and adults.
Thank you. To our very grown-up next question.
Philip Smith, given that we're in a church dedicated to St Andrew, patron saint of Scotland, and Ed Miliband's article and speech on Englishness, how would you describe your nationality?
You're wearing a dog collar. Are you connected with this church?
It's the church in which I minister, yes.
Thank you.
Or one of them.
Ed Miliband, amongst other things in his speech, said that he was proud to be British and proud to be English. How would you describe your nationality? Salma Yaqoob.
I'd say I'm British. I was born in Bradford, brought up in Birmingham. I consider myself a Brummie. I'm proud of being in this country. There's no other country I'd rather live in. I have 3 boys. They would consider themselves Brummies. They were born and brought up in Birmingham. And I also respect the fact that many people have multiple identities, and everybody's entitled to feel a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, in whichever way they see fit.
Do you, given Ed Miliband's point, do you think of yourself as British and English or not?
For me, to be honest, it's not like I have sleepless nights trying to define it. I'm just me.
Alan Johnson.
I am English and British, and the point that Ed Miliband was making yesterday, which is very important in the big debate that's coming up about devolution for Scotland, is that having one identity doesn't erode the other. The nationalist argument is that it does, and I don't think it does. at all. And last week at the Golden Jubilee, we saw the Union Jack. And as Ed Miliband was saying, we'll see the Union Jack again at the Olympics. In the time in between, we've got the football, and sadly, once again, Scotland didn't qualify, which is a great shame, but so there'll be the flag of St George. That's fine, and I think that it's very important for us to engage in this debate and not think it's just an issue for Scotland, because it's just as important to England and the rest of the United Kingdom.
Douglas Murray?
I consider myself British, and I'm always sad, I have to say, by how few people now do that. I think the United Kingdom is being split up by petty nationalists, and I think it's one of the saddest things of my life. I just had one other thing. I don't find it's to do with pride. People often say, I feel pride in being English or pride in being Scottish. I feel very grateful. I feel very grateful to be British and to be able to say that I'm British, and I'm grateful that so many other people feel the ability to do that too, and I'm grateful that as a country we welcome people.
David Davis?
I think I'm both English and British, and I think it's a good thing that Miliband made this speech. It was a much more subtle and thoughtful speech than Gordon Brown's rather clunky attempts in the past at defining Britishness, and so it's a good thing that he's opened it up. The only thing I disagreed with him about was that he somehow didn't think it was a part of our institutions and our history. You know, the reason that you are English or British, your choice, whether you're called Davis or Johnson or Yaqoob or Chakrabarti or whatever name it is because of our history, our institutions, our freedom under the law, the things we stand for. And that's what we should be both grateful for and proud of.
Thank you. Next week, incidentally, a Chakrabarti known as Shami Chakrabarti is going to be on this programme. Don't forget any answers after the Saturday broadcast of this programme, as well as your calls, tweets, emails, etc. Anita will be ready for your texts. The number for that is 84844, and I have to add that these texts will be charged at the standard rate. That's all we've got time for, unfortunately. Next week, I will be with any questions with Shami Chakrabarti from here in the North Aldborough Festival at St Andrew's Church. Goodbye.
Any questions came from St Andrew's Church as part of the Northern Aldborough Festival in North Yorkshire. The panel was former Labour Cabinet Minister Alan Johnson, former Conservative Minister David Davis, leader of the Respect Party Salma Yaqoob, and writer Douglas Murray. The chair was Jonathan Dibbleby and the producer was Victoria Wakely. Coming next, Adam Gopnik reflects on a universal truth of parenting, why at exactly age 13 your child will discover that you're the most embarrassing, ridiculous and annoying person on the planet. Adam puts his point of view after this.
On BBC Radio 4.
Exciting in some ways, dull in others, rather risky perhaps.
New drama based on a real solo flight halfway across the world.
My aim is to get there in good time and in one piece.
Is this really all?
Well, and I suppose to be able to fly.
Writing the century. Tiger Wings.
Joan Allen.
You on your own?
I'm with my trusty companion, Peg.
Does she need a bed too?
The airfield would do her just fine.
This Monday to Friday morning at 10.